Now they're mounting a public pressure campaign. Now they're saying they're going to go work in other states. Now they've changed their tune.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. Ms. Jones, can I just come to you? We have heard an extraordinary number of lies told about this law from the President of the United States all the way down, certainly including members of this committee, including today, and also from an unbelievable assortment of for-profit corporations. This has been one of the most incredible organized campaigns by these mega corporations in American history to try to influence legislation and ultimately to overturn it. And of course, these same corporations are now taking this effort to states across the country, no doubt soon coming to mind, to the state of Missouri, where we have our election integrity measures adopted by our voters in our legislature and also by referendum will soon, I'm sure, be in their sights. Let me just ask you about these lies that have been told over and over. The President of the United States, his big lie, that this legislation cut off the amount of time, closed the polls early. That was a lie. We've heard that water is not made available to people waiting in line. That's a lie. We've seen it told over and over and over. But I want to zero in on the corporations, their unprecedented power. Tell me, why do you think these corporations, so many of them, have been so eager to parrot lies that they know are not true? It's not like they don't have whole teams of lawyers. These are the most powerful corporations in the world. They have entire legal departments at their disposal. Why do you think they've been so eager to lie over and over about this law that your legislature adopted?
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. I can't speculate precisely on their motivation, but I can say that if they do have teams of lawyers and people to analyze the bill, their unjustified outrage is really ridiculous. And I believe most of these corporations, if they read the bill and compared our voting laws to most of the rest of the state, they would know that Georgia has an expansive system of voting. We've made it more expansive. And I must clarify, Senator, that Georgians always have had, for decades, the ability to offer early voting, or not decades, as long as we've had early voting, the hours of up to 7 to 7. That continues to be the case. What we did was counties that offered fewer than 9 to 5 early voting hours, we've required them. 134 more counties will offer longer early voting. But it has been disappointing to see some, and I will just say it's some in the business community, either not read the bill or feel that they would be punished somehow by some of these enormous nonprofit organizations that have placed a lot of pressure on them.
Let me just ask you about some of the pressure tactics that these corporations have brought to bear. We've seen in public what they have done. We've seen the statements that they have made and the lies that they've told. Tell me about the companies, what they've been doing in the legislature. I'm sure they have teams, fleets of lobbyists, just like they do here in this Capitol.
Right.
What are the sort of tactics that they have used there in the legislature to try to influence, intimidate? I mean, just give us a sense of what's been going on.
Well, I will say I worked closely on the bill and participated in the writing of every word of it. And I can say I was quite surprised by a couple of the companies' outrage, given that I never heard from a single one of them. And if they had, particularly, let me also say that by a couple of the chambers of commerce, the very provisions that they wanted retained in law were retained. And in fact, we went further by requiring now 2 Saturdays of early voting, whereas previously it was only 1 Saturday of early voting. So we expanded the ability for voters for early voting to vote, but yet I honestly, Senator, cannot explain their reaction other than to say they must fear some of these organizations that have an unbelievable amount of money. We've seen about $10 million spent already in Georgia uh, inaccurately portraying this legislation. And as you know, if you say something often enough, however inaccurate it is, there are those that will begin to believe it. And so perhaps they've been influenced by that.
So what you're saying is that many of these corporations that are now howling in public and are spreading active disinformation in public and lies, they actually had nothing to say earlier, but now they are out there denouncing the law, calling it voter suppression, calling it Jim Crow. And when they had the opportunity to actually shape the bill or work on the bill, they didn't. But now they're mounting a public pressure campaign. Now they're saying they're going to go work in other states. Now they've changed their tune and are trying to ratchet up the pressure. Have I got that right?
Well, I would just clarify by saying that the few provisions, if the chambers of commerce were representing their interest and they were not communicating with us specifically, we retained those provisions, like 3 weeks of very expansive early voting, and in fact expanded the number of hours available. We kept no excuse early voting, which I'm sorry to say, Delaware in particular, the president's state, does not have, and it neither has early voting. So we retained the few areas, and I supported those provisions. What I mostly hear is not facts from those who are, to use your word, howling about the bill, but rather incendiary, just propaganda that doesn't at all align with the facts of the bill.
Mr. Gardner, let me come just briefly to you and ask you here. Thank you, first of all, for being here, and just ask you about a statement you recently released about H.R. 1. You said, and I'm quoting you now, "Our state constitution requires that a voter must be present to vote unless a voter is absent from the town or city or physically disabled. This would also be taken away with H.R. 1. Contrary to our Constitution, H.R. 1 would require no excuse absentee voting, early voting with multiple election days, and continuing to receive and count ballots after the election." Just give us a sense of why these provisions are that are in your Constitution are so important in your view for election security in your state.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Abrams, it's been over 2 years, and you still refuse to concede that you lost the race for governor in Georgia in 2018. You have said that, quote, "you do not concede that the process was proper," and that, quote, "they stole it from the voters of Georgia." Yes or no, today, do you still maintain that the 2018 Georgia election was stolen?
As I've always said, I acknowledged at the very beginning that Brian Kemp won under the rules that were in place. What I object to are rules that permitted thousands of Georgia voters to be denied their participation in this election or to have their votes cast out. And so I will continue to disagree with the system until it is fixed. We have seen marked progress made, and unfortunately it was undone in SB 202, but I will continue to advocate for a system that permits every eligible Georgian to cast their ballots.
Ms. Abrams, I'm going to ask you to please answer the question I asked, which is, do you, yes or no, do you still maintain the 2018 election was stolen? That's your language.
My full language was that it was stolen from the voters of Georgia. We do not know what they would have done because not every eligible Georgian was permitted to participate fully in the election.
So you also told the New York Times that your loss, quote, was fully attributable to voter suppression. Ms. Abrams, do you know in Georgia whether the percentage of African-American Georgians who are registered to vote and who turned out to vote, is it higher or lower than the national average?
It is higher than the national average because Georgia is one of the largest states with an African-American population.
But that's not tied to the size of the population. The percentage of black Georgians who are registered to vote in 2018 is 64.7%. That compares to 60.2% as the national average. The percentage of Georgians who voted in 2018, the election you claim was stolen from you, was 56.3%. That's higher than the national average of 48%. Let me ask you this, Ms. Abrams. In 2018, do you know which demographic group in Georgia had the highest registration percentage and the highest turnout percentage?
I have a guess, but I will defer to you for the answer.
The answer is African Americans had the highest registration and the highest turnout, despite your claiming that the election was stolen and there was somehow voter suppression. Let's shift to the Georgia law in particular, which there have been mountains of lies spread by both Democratic politicians and by the press. Does the Georgia law reduce the number of early voting days? Yes or no?
Yes. It does so because you have to look at it in toto. It is not simply looking at the number of days that were expanded for 40% of the population, which for 60% of the population had been the norm. It also has to look at the early voting runoff days that were indeed shortened. If you add together the total number of days,
is it correct that the law increases the number of mandatory days of early weekend voting?
It is a partial answer to say that certain days were increased in certain counties that had not participated in the use of all of those days of elections. They had been optional, and most 60% of Georgians had been able to vote for those full number of days. 40% will now join, and that is a good thing. But at the exact same time, this same bill eliminates weeks of early voting during runoff elections and limits and allows the elimination of weekend voting.
Do you believe that requiring an ID to vote suppresses votes?
As I have said, written, testified, and have repeated today, I believe that voter identification is always appropriate. You should know who is voting. What I object to are the ways that we are narrowing and restricting who has access to the right to vote. And that has been a common and necessary complaint. As we noted in 2018, what happened to Native Americans in North Dakota who were denied the right to vote because they were required to have photo identification that included language and included perquisites that they were not entitled to demand. When we have narrowing of opportunities without expansion of access, that is absolutely wrong, and I will stand against it in Georgia and everywhere.
During the 2020 election, did your organization, Fair Fight, collect ballots for voters? And if so, were the people collecting ballots for your organization paid?
We did not collect ballots. We did not pay people to collect ballots. We sent to voters absentee ballot applications, as did the Secretary of State, as did a number of other organizations, because in the midst of a pandemic, we thought it was important for voters who may or may not have had information about what their rights were to ensure that they had the education and opportunity for engagement in our elections.
So I want to be clear about your testimony to this committee. Your testimony is that your organization did not pay any person in the state of Georgia in 2020 to collect ballots for anybody else.
No, sir.
Okay, thank you.
From Georgia, Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for joining us. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record a number of statements which may clarify for some of our colleagues the motives and circumstances that led to the passage of this infamous law in Georgia. Without objection. This is Georgia's Republican Lieutenant Governor, Jeff Duncan, who said about the law, quote, "This is really the fallout from 10 weeks of misinformation that flew in from former President Donald Trump." He further said, "There is solutions in search of a problem. Republicans don't need election reform to win. We need leadership." That was on Meet the Press. He further said in an op-ed in USA Today, knee-jerk reaction legislation, such as not allowing the distribution of water within 150 feet of a polling station just to appease the extreme right corners of legislators' districts and to avoid primary challenges. Ms. Abrams, in the exchange that you just shared with Senator Cruz, the question of early voting opportunities was raised. Can you please clarify for this committee what has changed about early voting and runoff elections in Georgia under this new law and what the impact might be of those changes?
Certainly. In the state of Georgia, previously, the law said that elections occurred during business hours. Most 60% of voters were able to vote between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., which is the hour of operation on election day. And so for the majority of Georgians, the time allowed was from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. The law now mandates that it be 9 to 5 p.m. with the option. The challenge with an optional permission is that it is no longer a given, and we have a number of counties that have taken options as an opportunity to restrict access. We celebrate the fact that more voters will have access to weekend voting, but it is not an expansion of a right when 60% of Georgians previously enjoyed that right. We know that 78% of Georgians were able to vote. I'm sorry. So the actual days and weekends. We know that 78% of Georgians were able to vote during those earlier voting hours, and that's what's being constricted. We know that, for example, in the state of Georgia, we have 159 counties, but some of our counties have a smaller population as fewer than 2,000 persons. And so it is insufficient to simply look at the number of counties participating. You have to look at the populations that are participating. And we know in the state of Georgia that this law is restricting access to the right to vote. We also know that the optional notion of a Sunday vote, for example, was something that counties felt that they had the right to do. And we had a number of counties that were already using Sunday voting. So yes, to the extent that it is clarified in the law, that is one thing. But to claim that it is an expansion of access for the majority of Georgians is not only untrue, it is misleading, and it is false.
And isn't it the case, Ms. Abrams, that under this new law where there were previously 3 weeks of mandatory early voting and runoff elections, now there's just 1?
Yes.
Ms. Abrams, Fair Fight Action, your organization, has issued an extraordinary report documenting the history of voter suppression in Georgia, which accelerated, as we've discussed in this hearing, following the Shelby County v. Holder decision of the Supreme Court, which ended the pre-clearance functions of the Voting Rights Act. Since 2013, since that Supreme Court decision, Georgia has closed hundreds of polling places, and the average distance voters have to drive to go vote has more than doubled. And not surprisingly, according to a nonpartisan analysis by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Black and brown voters have been impacted the hardest by many of these changes and are 20% more likely to miss voting in an election because of the long distances they're forced to travel. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter this Fair Fight Action report, Georgia's Enduring Racial Discrimination in Voting and the Urgent Need to Modernize the Voting Rights Act, into the record, with your permission.
Without objection.
Ms. Abrams, can you explain why the closure, the changing, and the consolidation of voting locations without DOJ preclearance can be so harmful, and why the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which again, to just remind everybody on this committee what we're here to discuss, we are talking about restoring Section 4 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, so the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division will pre-clear changes to election procedure and law that may have disparate, disproportionate racial impact. Ms. Abrams, why is restoration of the pre-clearance function so vital to ensuring harm is not done by the closure of polling locations such as those we've seen in Georgia over the last decade?
So over the last decade, we've seen more than 214 polling places closed. We have seen a number of consolidations and a number of shifts. We saw in Clayton County at one point an attempt, sorry, not in Clayton County, in Macon-Bibb County, an attempt to move a polling place from a location that was a publicly neutral place to a police station, which was going to have a deleterious effect on the likelihood of voters of color going to vote if they had to go to a police station to cast their ballots. We know that in the state of Georgia, under 2019 analysis by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, that the closure of polling places, given the sheer size of Georgia and the increased distance that people have to travel without access to public transportation, led to between 54,000 to 85,000 people who were not able to cast their ballots, and Black voters were 20% more likely to be affected by these closures. Taken together, the elimination or the changing of polling locations without accommodating those changes for communities that do not have access to public transportation, do not have cars, do not have the ability to drive. This changes their ability to participate in our elections. And I do want to clarify something I said earlier, Senator, with your permission. It is not that state legislators can change the composition of the SEB boards on their own motion. It is SEB itself. I did want to clarify that. but writ large, the way these laws are written with pre-clearance, instead of being able to wholesale remove access to voting locations, these voters would be protected by a process that looks at things like distance, cost of travel, access to transportation, and the ease of voting being either expanded or constricted. And it should always be our intention in the United States to increase access to the right to vote, never to restrict it.
Thank you, Ms. Abrams. Mr. Chairman, request 1 more minute.
I'm sorry.
Request just 1 more minute to ask a follow-up question.
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Abrams, the closure of these polling places and the changes of polling locations at the last minute, which anybody who's run for office and anybody who's voted in Georgia knows is common, causes all kinds of confusion, leads people to show up at the wrong precinct, often through no fault of their own. And again, I want to clarify for my colleagues on the other side who have taken a genuine interest in the contents of this new law in Georgia, exactly what these changes mean. And I hope that this is clarifying. Under the prior law, voters who showed up at the wrong precinct because of closures or changes could cast a provisional ballot at that precinct. Under the new law, if they arrive before 5 p.m., they are forced to go to a different precinct, to travel in some cases across town, in some of these counties, to travel up to an hour to a different precinct in order to cast their vote or risk disenfranchisement. Ms. Abrams, what does this change in the new Georgia law mean for voters who rely on public transportation to vote, or have their kids with them, or have a shift that they can't miss at work?
It presumes that people who vote before 5 p.m., that those people have universal access to transportation, to information, and the ability to change their behavior. But let's assume that you get into line at 1 p.m. and you get to the end of the line at 4:58 p.m., only to discover that you have used all of the time you have before your 6 o'clock shift to cast your ballot. It would no longer permit you to cast a provisional ballot, which was put in place under HAVA by this very Congress to solve for this problem. Those out of precinct provisional ballots would be discarded. And that is inappropriate because these are not people who are making the choice not to do what's right. During the 2020 and 2021 election, as you know, Fair Fight had volunteers standing in front of polling locations, directing people to new locations because they had been given misinformation or had not received information. And we know of a number of counties that changed their information. And while this new law attempts to address it, we know that the law has not been tested, and thus we do not know that voters will be protected. And to penalize voters before we know the protections necessary for their benefit are in place is anti-American.
Thank you, Ms. Abrams. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff.